Hey, good evening again. Just want to walk through this week's kind of lecture, kind of content with you. Now, this is a lecture that I would normally probably give in about an hour and a half class. In fact, I teach at another college and in person, face to face. And so this is the outline that I will use for the week. So I'm going to hit some points really quickly. I'm also going to attach the PowerPoint so you would be able to go back through and look at the PowerPoint. But I do want to hit some of the key points in here for us. So I'm going to ask the question: why do Britain? Spain gets here first. Last week we asked the question, why Spain? This week we're asking, why Britain and the Netherlands? All right, so Spain gets here first. France is kind of soon to follow. France is limited. They're trying to trade with the natives, and they set up good trade networks, but they really don't set up much beyond trading colonies or trading ports or trading locations. For instance, like St. Louis was here before the region in St. Louis was settled before, up on the Mississippi River, was settled before the British got here. So was Santa Fe, kind of like the question on the test this last week. What was the first region settled in the Southwest? Well, it was Santa Fe. And then there was also San Augustine and in Florida in 1525, which is the first settlement in America. Santa Fe was the first one in the Southwest. And then you have Quebec. And so you have four major urban trading centers, or significant, not major, but significant trading centers before the British get here. So how come it's the British that basically are the ones that end up dominating and colonizing America? So we look at America and we look at our British roots, all right? So how come, what are kind of the factors behind that really contribute to the rise of Britain in the Americas? And Holland is here about the same time, but they end up eventually will get pushed out. So I'm asking the question, why Britain and Holland? And then also kind of how does the arrival of the British in Holland, how does that play into the first evidence of slavery that we see in Jamestown, as you answered on the quiz this week probably? What were the two important events in Jamestown by 1620? And one is the House of Burgesses, and then the second one is the importation of slaves. All right. So without further intro, I'm going to hit my PowerPoint, and we're going to take a look at that. All right. So the Atlantic. This is the Atlantic. This is the rise of Western European power and slavery. Western European being primarily in this regard England and Holland. France and Spain are also Western European, but then there is also as you move east, you're going to get into Prussia, which is Poland at the time. You're going to get into the Germanic Empire. You're going to get into the Ottoman Empire. Then further east, you're going to get into Russia. All of those are major players in the monarchical system of Europe during this period. So what was the world population like around 1500? Well, you can see India and China just blowing the charts off. Western Europe about 57,000. And then the Americas about 54,000. So Western Europe much smaller geographically than the Americas at the time before the really at the time the diseases of the Europeans haven't quite hit yet in late 15th, early 16th century. So they're coming. But then you get Russia and Africa and Japan, and so you kind of see that numbers there. And in the world, there's less than 500,000 people in the world. Now we have over 7 billion. All right. So anyhow, North America. What is the population of the Americas? Well, North America only has. Sorry, did I misstate all that? Yeah. That's less than 500 million. can I go back and just retract all that? So that's 54 million, 55 million, 4,000 there in Asia. Western Europe, 57 million. The Americas, 54 million. All right, so there you go. Sorry, I messed that up. All right, so here we go. North America, 3.8 million. Mexico, Central America, everywhere else. So you have over 50 million in the rest of the Americas except for North America. All right, so North America is sparsely populated, but yet there's still what the Native Americans in North America are like. They're in small groups. They're not the major empires, except for Cahokia, but Cahokia has disappeared by this time. These are the mound builders near St. Louis area, and their civilization has really been in major decline since around 1300. And then also there was a major drought in the Southwest about that time, so a lot of the Southwest Pueblo Indians moved on. So there's a little bit of upheaval in North America already, but then you have the larger populations of about 55 million total. Native Americans in the Americas, and a very diverse group, as we've looked at between Aztecs, Mayas, Incas, and then the Pueblo, or you look at the mound builders, or the Caddo Indians, or over in the east, the Iroquois. So you have numbers of different Native American groups. All right, why Britain and the Netherlands? Well, the traditional view is because of religion and their advanced culture. Those were the two things. That this is advanced culture and religion. There is a superiority that's there. There's a cultural identity. The Reformation had taken place and really altered the religious landscape of Europe and kind of set country upon country against country. And so then you have that, and you get into these religious wars and civil wars that are going on in Europe during this time. So that's what's going on in Europe. And so what that does is leave the Americas, Britain is able to kind of break away and as much as they can distance themselves from that and focus on the Americas, but also at the same time the Americas are competing for their attention, whereas the Civil War in the 1600s against Charles I. You have wars against Spain that are going on, later 1500s with the defeat of the Spanish Armada, things like this that are going on in Europe, in the European sector, that is distracting them from the colonies, and so the colonies are kind of going to kind of feed on their own. Then you have advanced culture. They, of course, Europeans viewed themselves as having the advanced culture of Greco-Roman philosophy, rising merchant bank system, and strong monarchs. So let's talk about a couple of those things. Number one, religion. First of all, Martin Luther set the stage, and you can see the top Martin Luther, kind of a traditional portrait of him. Below is Ralph Fiennes, who starred him in the movie not long ago. It's a great little movie. It's very accurate. It's very helpful. But you can see Martin Luther posting his 95 Theses on the church door at Wittenberg, and those 95 Theses where he calls for a reform in the Catholic Church. He was not trying to destroy the Catholic Church. He was trying to reform the Catholic Church. But what happens is his statements now get put on paper, get put out by Gutenberg, the Gutenberg Press, and his ideas sweep rapidly in Europe within 2 to 3 weeks and just a few months even, which at that time was lightning speed. That's like hitting Twitter of, his time. And it was an amazing revolution, the ideas, because you find now people in Holland, people in England, people in France, people in Spain that are not much Spain, because Spain has just recaptured themselves and they are really reasserting Catholicism there. But there are these ideas that are beginning to sweep, and the ideas have legs and run all over Europe. Well, they run as far to the Americas. And Roger Williams, and kind of the idea is that Martin Luther is that the individual is accountable before God. That's where, Renaissance and humanism started focusing on the individual. We talked about that last week. Well, now it's the individual, but in the individual in light of who God thinks he is and who the individual thinks God is. And because of this, Martin Luther creates this direct path to God. And there is a group of people that are gathering in Holland that have run away from Britain and Germany and other places, and they're called Anabaptist. Anna means again, and so they're baptizing again, and so it's people who believe in believer's baptism. In other words, you have to make a religious conversion first, a spiritual conversion to Christ first before you are baptized into the church. Well, one of these is Roger Williams. So in the Americas, even in Massachusetts Bay Colony, there is a resistance against an outspoken word like Roger Williams. And you can see in the image here, what is he doing? He's communicating to the Native Americans. Rather than oppressing them, he's trying to communicate with them. One of the novel ideas he had was to buy and to purchase and to create a deal with the Native Americans rather than just impose British rule or European rule in those areas. And so he was quickly kind of ousted from Massachusetts, and he ends up in Rhode Island. And Roger Williams starts the First Baptist Church in America in 1636, which Baptist, if you don't know, are individual congregations with the individual having the greatest strength and greatest communication. They are very individualistic. And this is established in America by Roger Williams. And so you have that. And this idea of individuality and individual accountability. And, I kind of look at it this way. If a person can make the most important decision that a Baptist or a Christian will make is to follow Christ. All right? And once they follow Christ, all decisions of eternity are decided. So that's the most important decision in life. So then why can't I make decisions about politics, decisions about economic policy, or decisions about international diplomacy? If I can make the decision that affects my life and all eternity, how come I can't make some of these other decisions for myself? And so this individualism of Roger Williams and Baptist will go all the way through, and I say even all the way and through until today. So this reform in Europe spreads to America. It's Protestant. It's anti-Catholic. In fact, Baptists don't even have crosses in their church until about the turn of the 20th century because they don't want to be thought of to be Catholic. And so this stronger reform movement, this small little group of Baptists, begins to populate Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterians. These individualistic congregations begin to arise. Now, what about European culture? The traditional view says, well, it was Greco-Roman philosophical science, and in this image here, you can see Greek and Roman philosophers, you can see Greek and Roman government officials, but then in the clouds you see the gods. So you have the philosophical scientists, you have the government, and you have religion all working in unity together. And so that's kind of what European monarchs thought at this time. That was the idea in Europe at the time, was for philosophy, for science, for religion, for politics to all work together. So there was not necessarily freedom of religion, although it might have been a Protestant religion. For instance, when Henry VIII establishes the Protestant Church, the Church of England breaks away from the Catholic Church, he still sees that as a state church. We call that magisterial reform, okay? So it is really the Baptist and the Anabaptist who begin to say true religious liberty and separation of church and state, whereas Anglicans, Church of England, John Knox, and the Reformed tradition of Calvinism in France, all of those retained their state, or Luther in Germany. Basically, what they come down to is this treaty that basically says, whatever the king is, that's what the people are. If the king is Lutheran, the church is Lutheran. If the king is Catholic, then the nation is Catholic, okay? So anyhow, then you have the rising merchant system. We talked about that last week. This is a little artwork there of Marco Polo on the Silk Roads. And so this rising merchant banking system, and these really strong monarchs that you see over here, Philip II of Spain that's going to arise, Louis XIV, you're going to get Peter the Great. I love Peter the Great. But anyway, and then Frederick II of Prussia. These are examples of what we call absolute monarchists. And these absolute monarchs believe that they have the divine authority. God put them in place as king. You know, and as a Christian, as you read Romans 13, that it says that the authorities or the powers that exist, you know, in the country, or the powers or government that exists, is in place because God allows it. In fact, Paul writes that when Nero, the persecuting Roman emperor, is emperor of Rome. And so here these absolute monarchs say, I'm in place because God is. And so that means they can control everything. They control morals, they control the church, they control the economics, they control everything. And so economically, they're going to promote what we call monopolies. Okay, let me see here. Where did I put it? Yeah. All right. So anyway, so we're looking at now why Britain and why the Netherlands. And so instead of the traditional view, there's been an article and some books and some other things written, several other books that have been written, but I'm going to refer to primarily one article that takes an economic perspective, and it's from the over here in the bottom left. You can see that this is the rise of the Europe Atlantic trade, institutional change, and economic growth. So basically, what their thesis is doing is challenging the traditional view, because they say, no, it's not culture, it's not religion, all of these things that over time have been given credit for the rise of European America. But what they're saying is that really their thesis is this: well, it was really just the countries that were closest to the Americas, the proximity to the Atlantic, all right? Not only just the proximity, the closeness to the Atlantic, because you get Great Britain and you get Holland, and of course Holland is you keep up here, keep going this way, you get up to Holland up here, the Netherlands, so Denmark, and so you get up there, and then but it's really it's that in combination with the presence of institutions to check the monarchy, like down here in this picture. You have Queen Elizabeth in the middle 1500s, and then you have the House of Lords and House of Commons here that are calling into question and holding. Now, it becomes this dynamic between the monarch and between the House of Commons, and so you have the Lords and Commons, the commoners down here, but you have the Queen up here sitting in court in Parliament, and as this dynamic between the two that is working in unison. So with that, those institutions, the House of Commons checks the power of the monarch, whether it's Elizabeth, whether it's James I, or Charles III, George III, or whoever it might be. Charles I, they actually depose him and kill him, so, behead him. So that is calling into question the power and authority of the monarch. And so, and those two things play together. Because when you have the monarchy, it's why Britain and the Netherlands, it's the geographic proximity. It's the non-absolutist. They're not the absolute monarchs. Yes, these monarchs have power, and yes, they claim power. But yet, whereas Elizabeth, following Henry VIII called himself the supreme head of the church. But who do we know is the head of the church? That is Christ. Well, Elizabeth says that she is the supreme governor of the church, not the head. She kind of help manages that. It's almost like saying she's the pastor, all right? And so she's the overseer of the Church of England, all right? Now, in these non-absolutist political institutions like Parliament in Norway and Sweden and Denmark, those parliaments up in the Netherlands are going to play a major role. And then you have Denmark, and then you have Britain, and these are going to be the two main. These are going to be the two main kind of trade entities in North America, all right? So they're going to go in, and they establish not royal monopolies. A royal monopoly is where the king, like the King of Spain or the King of France, will say, we give you, King of France would say, we give you a monopoly, a group, an individual, a monopoly on the fur trade over in Canada. So only this individual can sell furs back to France from Canada. This is the rise of piracy too, because here is coming the king's ship that is coming back, all right? It's the king's ship with the fur, with whatever resource that has been discovered, and so a particular company, and so these ships are really military vessels as well, whereas the difference between that and stock companies is like, hey, we get together and we say, hey, King, do we have permission to go over there and start our own company? Yeah, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. All right, good. You can start that. Jamestown, you can start that. You can go, Denmark starts Holland, or Holland starts New Amsterdam, which is New York, which becomes New York. And eventually the British overtake that. And so, but these are individual companies where a group of people has bonded together to make their company. So now, whereas in a royal monarchy, the king gets all the proceeds, except for the individual who gets that money. So money is held in a tight-knit group. Stock companies, it's whoever owns stock in that company. Whoever owns stock in that company. And so without a lot of restrictions, yeah, there are restrictions, but not with as many restrictions as are on a royal monarchy. And so money begins to distribute into other hands. And so people, when they start making money, or where there's an opportunity for them to make money, they become creative with how they make money. One of the ways is African slavery. Okay, you read this last week about the ship that comes into Jamestown in 1619, 1620 and unloads a number of slaves. Those slaves were already enslaved in Africa. They come over to the Americas. They already are considered property, and so then it becomes a form of income, but not immediately. So first of all, there was an effort for Britain to enslave native people, or to not really enslave, because Sir Thomas More in his work Utopia in 1516 kind of says, and if I could zoom in on this, here's this picture of Utopia. This is a inside cover of his book. I guess I don't have that in the right spot. So yes, that is the inner cover. Down here is the Granger collection here. All right, so here you see this colony, and so what it's depicting is that here comes this more advanced civilization of England coming in contact with native peoples. And there were going to be two kind of native peoples that Sir Thomas More says. There were going to be good natives, and there were going to be bad natives. There were going to be natives that would say, oh, wow, this is an advanced civilization coming over here to us. We have a lot to learn from them. We need to cooperate with them. And so let's partner and let's unite with them. And then there was going to be a group that were going to be resistant, rebellious. And so, Europeans or Britain would call them kind of the bad or the rebellious or recalcitrant, whatever you want to call them. And so here, but what would happen in Utopia, according to More, is that the receptive natives, along with the superior culture of Britain, would bond together and then drive away those recalcitrant, those resistant native peoples. And so there would be a civilization that would morph together, bringing the best from both cultures, and there would be this utopia. Britain has an example of overwhelming an unprepared culture, and that was the Irish. They did do that. And so they have experience with doing that. And so More's theme here in 1516 was not far-fetched to them. Okay? So they think they're going to come over to the Americas with this idea of utopia, that we're going to create this utopian society over there. Well, when they get here, they discover that's a really impractical idea. You take a look here. This is on Thanksgiving Day. This is about this is out of the Granger collection in New York City, and you see British men fighting European men fighting Native Americans, driving them away. But a couple of things here you see with the Native Americans. They are defensive. They have weapons. They have fires. They have shields. They have knives. This is a different situation than an African who has been captured and comes over with nothing but a loincloth. All right? Native Americans are in their own region. They're in their own country. So if they can ever escape, what do? They just filter back into their culture, into their tribe, into their ethnic group. And so they disappear. They know this land is different for an African. So why in African slavery and not indentured service? Well, indentured service, you can see here, there's a contract. Usually these were immigrants of indentured service, poverty. They were coming from poverty, but they were looking for a fresh start. So they were working for their passage over here. Or they were working off a debt, or they were working off a debt that they owed in England. And so their term of service would typically be anywhere from 7 to 14 years until they worked off their passage and any debt that they may have, all right? And so this required less of an investment on the person, the owner, the one who held their indentured contract. And so the length of the contract, because of the length of the contract, only 7 to 10 years, if the indentured servant lived the whole time, then the person, the owner of the contract, would have to then free them, give them what their conditions of the release, promise of a headright land, in other words, 50 acres of land, probably out of their own land or out of government lands, tools, clothes, and a weapon generally is what the contract would stipulate that the indentured servant received upon their release. Well, that took some money, but then the person who owned the contract, if they still needed labor, they would need to go buy another indentured servant. But then there's also this high mortality rate that kind of early on in Jamestown and in the Americas, but especially Jamestown, because of their disease-ridden waters and their bad soils, and it was really just a hard scrabble living there. But really what happens in Jamestown is there is this high mortality rate. All right? And so it is a better investment to take a risk on somebody to buy at a lower cost, rather, an indentured servant at a lower cost rather than a slave at a higher cost. Okay, so this would be a better investment for the meantime until one thing changes: the mortality rate. You can look at the Virginia population, 1635. This is 1635, and you can see my little things over here. That's 1635. 1635. 1629, 1635, 32. The chart puts these out of order. All right, but you can see that going along, that somewhere right in here, this is going to be 1653, and this is going to be 1652. There is a significant jump right here, and researchers have looked at this, and the significant jump during this time is an improvement in the mortality rate. In other words, how long people live, the expected lifespan. Do children live when they are born? Do they live beyond the age of 2 or 5? Do they live to adulthood? Do people live beyond 35 into 50 or into their 70s? So that's going to cause a population growth, all right? So we know two things are problematic in Virginia. Number one, disease. Number two, you also have bad soil, all right? And most of the soil in Virginia was spent growing what? Growing tobacco to earn money to send back, and so then they could buy the things that they need, but they're not producing as much crop, food substance as early on as possible. So, but you see this, and by the time 1699 gets here, there's just over there's almost 63,000 people. But look how many people immigrated during this time. Over an average of 1,000 people a year, about 1,000 or more people a year. So from the beginning of Jamestown until 1699, you have anywhere from 80 to 100,000 additional immigrants, not to count all the people that are born there. All right? But yet we only have a population of 63,000. Because look down here at these early years, just bad mortality rate. You finally see this mortality taking, the mortality and the immigration taking effect in unison and causing this population growth. Well, it's not until this change in mortality, in the mortality rate, until later in the 17th century, that the preferred choice of labor becomes slave rather than indentured servant. So up until about 1699, the most preference for labor is indentured servant. After that, it really becomes slavery. And I get this out of one of the books that I read is Edmund Morgan, and it's Virginia Slavery. It's great work and has very good things. So here you can see the population in 1635 was about 1,300, and in 1699 about 6,300. Slave population, both of these groups here, either the Historical Study or Edmund Morgan, both these are this would be an estimate. They kind of agree on that. However, the slave population from the historical statistics of the U.S. will say it's at about 27%. Edmund Morgan has gone in there after that and has kind of revised that. But anyway, we're going to say somewhere between 16 and 25% probably, probably somewhere around 20,000, somewhere around 12 to 15,000 slaves during this time period. Now, take a look at women, about 25%. And this stays pretty constant all the way through that 17th century, all the way from the founding of Jamestown all the way through. In fact, at times early on, it was 10 to 1. And so that women are 4 to 1 here at the, by 1635 and at the end of the 17th century is somewhat of an increase. All right. So that's going to create some social dynamics. All right. If you know what I mean. So why African slavery? Well, less absolutist forms of government, because an absolute form of government, the monarchy required taxes, levies, tariffs, limited economic motive for people, all right? So their royal charters and monopolies limited who could really be involved in that, and so it would limit the impact of slavery. Yes, France had slaves, yes, Spain had slaves. France, not so much France did have slaves in the Caribbeans, and so yes, they would have slaves, but it would only be because of a monopoly, and not a lot of people took part in that, and so it would limit the overall impact. But when you get these political institutions that check monarchical power and these monopolies that favor this emerging economic system that really begins to distribute profit to these stock companies. Now, the individuals that own these stock companies, now they're benefiting. Well, guess what? If I'm benefiting from the trade, it's in my interest then to get cheaper labor. And so with the increase of the mortality rate as the century goes on, and with the increase of British invasion, British immigration, you get, and Dutch and French to some degree, with the invasion of this, you get more in the slave systems. All right? There is also this perceived racial inferiority from day one. Whether it is, Britain and Europe, whatever European country you're from at that time, probably, you consider your country better than the next one. France thought they were better than Spain. Spain thought they were better than England. England thought they were better than France and Spain. All right. And so you get this superiority. And so extend that out to Native Americans, the Irish, to Africans. And so, yes, there is this superiority. But here it links racial superiority. This is what slavery does. It links racial superiority with economic policy. Don't have to pay for labor. You just buy labor. You don't have to pay hourly. You don't have to pay, intermittently over time. You just pay for your labor all at once. It is all wrapped up in the person because you own that person. Their labor is part of the person. That is what Marx is going to say much later, but we will stay away from Marx right now. All right. So the improvement of the mortality rate, mentioned that. The legal status in court. Who was a slave? Was a child of a white master and a black slave woman. What was the status of the child? Well, they go to court. Court settles that. Could slaves marry? The court settles that. The status of the family. Were they to be held together or could they be divided? And so those kind of issues were settled in the court in the 1600s, a lot of times through British court. And so it becomes, basically American colonial law. All right. And so once that's all settled out, and then now somebody knows by the beginning of the 17th century, somebody in America knows that they can buy a slave and that their family will be their slaves. Their children will be their slaves. They're generational. If they have, if a woman is going to have children, then her slaves are going to be the possession of the master. And so then you can look at that and say, oh, that's a lot more profitable than indentured servant. And then slaves, African American slaves, are much less likely to run away than Native American slaves, because they are in this new land, know where to go, don't know what is out there. Yes, did they try to escape? Yes, they did try to escape. So I'm not saying everybody. I'm just saying in general, the attitude was, I can escape, but where do I go? I came across an ocean. Where am I? I can't even speak the language. All right, so tough deal for African Americans. And then the practicality of knowledge, that's kind of what I'm mentioning. They do have knowledge of farming. They have been trained, and they are skills that they have. They've learned agriculture in their homeland or in the Caribbean, and they are also distant from home. Oh, sorry, hit the wrong one. All right, so take a look at the slave trade. And so take a couple of numbers on here may surprise you. Overall, between 1650 and 1860, 15 million, 10 to 15 million enslaved people were transported, all right? About 3 million went to Europe. About 0.3 million went to Europe. About 4.5 million went to the West Indies. This is where a lot of slaves that ended up in the United States, they came here first, and they were seasoned, they were trained, they were educated, they learned the language. And about 80% of slaves made it to their destination on the boats. But then in that first year, close to 75% of slaves died. Number one, from disease. Number two, from depression and suicide. And 3, attempting to escape. All right? And so about 25% live. So you have about about 500,000 here that actually make it to the United States on boats. Yes, some of the West Indies are sold into North America. Take a look. There's 500,000 here over in Lima, brought around here. What kind of trip would that take? All the way down to Valparaiso. About 5 million down into South America, Brazil area. And so this kind of gives you a little bit of what the trade was back and forth. But you can see that really, there is this incredible amount of people just migrated from the western coast of Africa. And what's directing this here a lot is trade winds. You can see that the initial part of the route is going south, and then there is some that will come from Angola that can catch a wind and head up that way with some difficulty. All right, so into Mexico, into Central America. These here, 4.5 million would have been into the West Indies, maybe New Orleans, and then Mexico City. But at that time, New Orleans was not part of the Americas, all right? So part of Britain Empire. Oh, gosh, where does slavery go from here? Because it becomes a viable economic system. Slaves become no more than a piece of property, an ad in a paper, the one ads, eBay, Etsy, whatever it is, being sold. This is their ride on the way over here. Every one of these little lines laying down here, every one of these little dots is the head of a slave. And this is one level of the boat. Oftentimes, boats had 3, 4, 5 levels under there. They would be on rope, kind of cargo netting beds, about less than 3 feet apart, usually about 2 feet apart. And they were stripped naked and shackled to a pole on their bed. They were not let up to go to the bathroom. They were not let up to eat. They were not set free to walk about on deck or anything else like that. They were chained in that position. Do you know why you get seasick? You get seasick because you can't see the horizon. How many of these people got seasick? It's just unbelievable. Okay. This is the inner in the hull in some boats. This is the drawing of a ship's surgeon. A doctor drew this in 1760. It becomes an atrocity on the rise. It's one of the most shameful events in world history. All right. So, kind of that's our story for the week. And I hope you see that, number one, why the article that talks about it's the close proximity, it's the non-absolutist governments that really kind of make it favorable for England and the Netherlands to take advantage of what has kind of been left alone by Spain and is not overly populated by Native Americans. And so Britain finds a home on the East Coast. It's very similar in weather and climate and that type of thing as well, as is England. And so that becomes a dominant thing. So when we look at this, the interaction with the environment, here is the proximity environmentally and climate association. In the days ahead, we'll see how slavery patterns exist in the North and in the South, and we'll see how that exists. All right. So have a good week. I hope that you, if you need anything, please let me know. All right. Thank you.